Do you think a fair approximation, because I think the backlash narrative is so important, that this is almost like a second Reconstruction, or is that overstating it? Backlash and vitriol and what Trump is trying to do?
No, I do think it is. And I think, some of the scholars of Civil War and Reconstruction may not agree with that, but I do think it is because there are a lot of parallels to things that are happening right now. Even if you look at the recent NAACP travel warning for the state of Missouri, that's unprecedented. That's never happened. The things that they were warning people about, African Americans about, for travel to Missouri are things that you saw during the post-slavery era, the lynchings, the murders, the rape, all these kinds of things that were happening are happening today. And so I think that this is definitely a moment. We can talk about years of where we are. Well, what decade does this represent? Does this represent the 1870s? Does this represent the 1880s? Does this represent the 19-teens? I mean, I think you could find evidence and remnants of that today with what we're dealing with in terms of the racial tension and the political climate that we're in.
How do you sort of deal with these comparisons to the past? Like that very question about what decade is it?
And, it's funny because students love to try to use the past to say, well, that's why this is like today, or that's why this is happening today. All the different events and outcomes and historical things that have happened that led to today. We can't just say, well, yes, this is why it explains it. There's so many different things that have happened in between. So, yeah, I think we're all about, people in my profession, about putting context, knowing the literature, knowing what some of the arguments are around a certain time period or a certain movement. And that's what we do. It's hard to make these comparative jumps, but we can say that, you see similar patterns, right? We can say that this election is similar to another election because of the outcomes, and we can make those kinds of direct claims. But we do have to be careful not to just make these broad generalizations as well.
Yeah, because on one hand, thinking about, the backlash to Barack Obama. So he's the first president who happens to be black, but he's not a black president. We can certainly talk about that. But symbolically, and sort of what he represents and sort of the right wing, and I dare say some liberals too, but sort of the collective white political and historical imagination. I was thinking about, as I found a book that's a great collection of essays, and it's in there, sort of these narratives during Reconstruction and after about threats of Negro domination of white people.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, so there's something going on here. And especially thinking about Trump's voters and white racial resentment. Hell, the Klan endorses this man. Neo-Nazis endorse this man. He's trafficking in overt he's surrounded by real white supremacists. And I'm scared because, and I should know better, but it's still disturbing how normalized this has become.
I don't know that it's become normalized. I think it's always been there. To that threat that the KK says of you've awoken the sleeping giant. So I think the sleeping giant has been here. It now has a voice and a platform that's more public than it has been in recent years.
Like, how would you, again, as a historian, thinking about the different periods of the Klan?
The rallies that you saw in the news about the Charlottesville, I think some of it began to be more public with the Dylan Roof killings in 2015. I think that was, his statement was something that shocked a lot of Americans, right? And that he could go into a church and kill 9 African Americans. But the language when they went to his website and they read things about him was very similar to a number of other websites and a number of other groups, organizations, and individuals that feel this way, that have been feeling this way. They just now, is what I would say, have a platform. We are starting to see with Black Lives Matter, whenever they're out protesting or speaking out against things, the Klan is starting to show up. I served on a committee for some statues that they were going to be putting up to look at the celebration of African American history and contributions to Texas history. And I was warned that I had to be careful with what I was saying because they were still active members of the Klan and they didn't want me to offend them. That was just 2 years ago.
Yes, we can talk about other folks who have been traumatized. We know about the Jews or Roma, but they're looking at the specific example of across the Black Atlantic, that the past ain't past. Collective impact of that trauma, psychologically, emotionally, think about police brutality, and I'm sure most Black folks have a story like this, the way you sort of have to maintain your cognitive map and your awareness, especially if you, depending on your family traditions and how stories are passed down about common sense. This was not too long ago, late 90s, maybe mid 90s. From Connecticut, going with my mother and father, driving around and went on a day trip. I don't know where the hell we were going. Ended up driving through Torrington, Connecticut. Little did we know that's where the Grand Wizard was from. Almost like a sundown town. It was getting dark. We were lost. And I will never forget it. There was a noose on a tree near the gas station to get some gas. My mother goes in there and this white man came back and it's like, we need to leave. I was like, why, Mom? She's like, that man said, I strongly suggest you colored people get out of town before it's too dark. That was in the mid 90s in Connecticut. But I'm curious, how did you decide to become a historian? I'm always fascinated by people's life journeys. How'd this happen for you?
So I had two events that really shaped my desire to become a historian. One was a positive event and one was a negative event. The first was the negative event where I was in a class at UCLA, and there was a visiting professor there that was happened to be a white man from the South, and he was teaching African American history, and he used the N-word every single day in class. And every example he used about African Americans was offensive to me. Not just the use of the N-word, but also just the way he described African Americans and African American history was that African Americans were so unempowered. And that wasn't the way I was raised. I wasn't raised thinking that I came from this poor people who suffered. And my parents taught me to be proud of my ancestry and to know that we are a strong people. And so I challenged him, and I got what I call academic detention, and he had me come to see him every Wednesday afternoon. And we had these conversations, and it was in those conversations that I decided that I wanted to become a historian, because I learned from him that history is about interpretation. And everybody, you can read the same document that I read, and you can see something completely different than what I see in that document. And so I try to empower my students to do the same thing. Like, we can, because of your life experiences and the things that other books that you've read are going to allow you to see that history differently and interpret it differently. And so I thought, well, you know what? If I ever have children, I want them to read history books that don't disempower them as African Americans. So I thought, well, I want to become a historian. So I decided to become a historian. I go talk to the department chair, and this is at UCLA, and he says, well, there's a Black woman scholar that's coming to the university next year, and I think you should take her class. She's teaching a class on slavery. And I said, okay, well, I'll do that. And that woman was Brenda Stevenson, and she ended up becoming my dissertation advisor. Because of the experiences with her and taking this class, I decided that was what I was going to do. It's been history ever since.
You said something really interesting that made me smile about learning or being taught by your parents and others that Black folks are just not victims in our own story, that you have rich history. The way my godparents would always, I don't know, looking back now, maybe some of I shouldn't have seen it 7 or 8 years old, books about lynchings, Black cowboys, which is always cool. I don't know if your parents or grandparents got you this book. It's probably in its 50th edition. I think it was like Toni Morrison worked on it, the Black Book. And I remember it was like being 7 or 8, looking at this book, being like, oh my God, there were Black cowboys. Wow, they fought the Klan. My goodness, there were slave rebellions. We weren't just singing and picking cotton. And that is so transformative psychologically. But even in the year 2017, the idea that Black folks are at the center of American democracy as freedom fighters, as the conscience of a country, and resisted slavery at every opportunity. But why do you think that's so scary for some people, even today? And I will dare say it, I think there are some Black folks who are afraid of this history of resistance.
There's a narrative, and it's also about where we've been put underneath. So you have this idea that African Americans were enslaved for so long, right? I think there's been, whether subconscious or conscious, effort to keep African Americans down. And so part of that is to not tell the stories the same way, not teach the history a certain way, and to make it sound like, well, they were fit for slavery. So if you look at some of the older textbooks, Black people were fit for slavery. They could survive malaria. They had the sickle cell gene.
We're impervious to pain. That's the one I love. Our skin is thick. And that's still taught in some medical schools. The Black folks' skin is thicker.
Absolutely. And so some of this contributed to that. Some of this, the grand narrative of American history, contributed to keeping African Americans down. Like you said, some African Americans bought it and buy it today. The level of self-hate within the African American community is pretty significant among some populations. So when I wanted to do history, and the way I look at the way I was raised and the things that my parents taught me, and we traveled all over the country, went to museums. We've studied all aspects of history, not just African American. I knew where I came from. We did our family genealogy, and we traced it back as far as we could, and we kept digging and digging. We went to historical sites and all kinds of places as a kid. My parents just drove all over the country and took us everywhere, and they wanted us to learn. And because of that, though, I feel like my perspective is not this victim narrative. It hasn't been. And so I thought to myself, how did 4 million African Americans make it out of slavery? How did they survive? They were walking around in this melancholy state, which there were some, don't get me wrong. There were a number of enslaved people that were completely depressed.
Broken psychologically, trauma. That's the whole point, to break a person.
Absolutely. And some of them, there were a number of, I don't know the numbers, we don't have statistics, but so many of them were in that state. But there were also people that I think we have not talked about, those that valued their souls, that valued themselves, and those like the Nat Turners and the Harriet Tubmans and the people who fought back, those that were free Blacks that had never been enslaved, that fought against slavery, like David Walker. There's so many people that fought against this institution. And I thought, well, I'm interested in knowing how they valued their souls. And so I wanted to write a book that talked about this level of survival and to include this group of people in this larger history. So that when we talk about those that were socially dead or that could not survive, that were broken mentally, there's other individuals that were not. And I just wanted to make sure that those stories were also part of this narrative.
Like, so you're in the archives and you're reading these stories. So you're looking at ledgers. You're looking at how Black human property was quite literally valued from the womb to the tomb. And then afterwards, we're certainly talking about what happened with these medical schools, Black bodies being sold and people being experimented upon. Like, do you feel like they're watching you? I know for some people, they wouldn't get that question, like that sense of sacred responsibility that they're there and somehow you're doing something and they're channeling their memory.
I've said this one other occasion. I was interviewed and somebody asked me something similar to what you just asked. And I was like, okay, people are going to think I'm crazy. But then the more I've talked about it, people don't think I'm crazy. And that is, yes, I do feel like I've been guided sometimes to sources, stories, to individual enslaved people that I would have never found. You know, the coincidence of me finding a particular record or a document or a ledger book that was hidden in a way that it would have never come out. It wouldn't have come in my searches of the catalogs of the archives. So to me, it's like when I was writing and when I write, I try to make sure that I'm telling stories that want to be told, that I feel like I have permission to tell them. And there's been times where I was reading about, a very, very brutal experience that somebody experienced, an enslaved person. And I felt like there was some level of shame, not from my perspective. I just felt like I didn't have permission to tell that story. And that's happened to me. So I try to stay very centered and very focused. And I think that happened with the Nat Turner piece in chapter 4, where I write about him. I felt like I needed to find everybody who may have had their hands on his skull. And I needed to be able to document. I needed to just keep digging and digging and digging and tracing and trying to find out where it might have gone, where it was traced to, who touched him, who touched him after he died. And so that was what motivated me. And oftentimes I was doing that work right around his birth date or his death date, and I didn't know it until I was, all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, today's the day Nat Turner was hung, November 11th. Oh my gosh. And so there was all these really coincidental discoveries that happened around historical moments that connected that person to who they were. And so I don't think that's an accident. I can't explain it. It may be supernatural. So I might be this nutty professor, and that's fine. I'll take the title.
The supernatural is just science we don't understand. We're all part of this continuity of history and of resistance. The Black freedom struggle is something to be honored, not to be ashamed of. And unfortunately, we got some brothers and sisters who are ashamed.
Yeah, we do. We have a lot of people that are ashamed of the history. Start off when I teach my classes, especially classes that look at African American history in the United States. I begin with the Spanish and Portuguese explorers that had Africans with them. Not all Africans that came to the United States, what became the United States, came as enslaved people. Slavery becomes racialized. It doesn't start off racialized. It becomes racialized over time.
Point about African explorers in the quote-unquote New World, Florida, Latin, and South America. As a historian, what do you do in those moments? Because I know it's a tired expression, the personal is political, but I think maybe in some ways it's more true than not. And you're looking around and, oh boy, the Black students looking at the floor, ashamed, embarrassed, don't want to talk about it. Where is their shame?
Well, I draw from my own experience growing up in predominantly white schools and having, whenever they talked, which was very rare, whenever African American history in particular was mentioned, everybody would stare at me. I think I was about 5 or 6. One of my classmates asked me, well, what was it like when you guys were slaves? Like I was supposed to know, like I had been enslaved at some point. And so I had all these experiences. So when I look at the college class and when I'm teaching and if I see or can witness or sense a sense of shame from African American students, I talk about the history as a whole. And I try to make my classroom an open palette. And I try to find a way to empower the story so that people don't come into it as a victim, that the white students don't come in guilty and the Black students don't come in angry or victimized. So I try to present it and say, let's unpack this history. Let's understand it. Let's go into it and look at the diversity of this institution and the diversity of narratives within this institution and the diversity of the people that were either on one side or the other of it. It really is about the kind of documents that I will bring in. And it's not that I'm trying to shape a narrative. I want to open up their minds so that they can see the full history and not walk with this narrow perspective based on what they either learned in high school or junior high school, what they didn't learn. And I'm finding, though, after having taught for almost 20 years, students are coming into my classes with more background than 15 years ago. You know, I've had students that have read the narrative of Frederick Douglass. I've had students that have listened to slave work songs. They had a deeper understanding of the history than 10 years ago when I taught this. You know, I used to teach it and students had never heard of Harriet Jacob. Now I have students that come in and say, oh, we read her in high school. Or I was like, oh, really? So I have stopped being shocked. And now I'm just like, okay, what do you guys know? Let me know, like early in the class, I'll ask students, okay, what have you guys been taught about slavery and African American history? Let's get it all out on the board. Go write down, when you think about slavery, write down all the words, like sort of a word association game. Just put down everything. And at first, 10 years ago, there were a bunch of stereotypes all over the board. And now you'll see they're thinking about it critically. So they're not just Sambo.
Happy slaves picking cotton, eating watermelon.
Exactly. They're not writing that anymore. They're writing resistance. They're writing strength. They're writing words like rebel, freedom fighter. And I've seen that in the last 5 to 7 years.
Now, do you think that's just a generational replacement issue where we have just a new cohort of young teachers who are trained in a similar way? Is it something going on with curriculum? I mean, what do you think, or is it a cultural moment? Why do you think that's happening?
I think it's a generational. I don't think it's yet curriculum because the texts are still, they have a long way to go. Black people were immigrants, right?
We're brought here to work willingly. They're just happy immigrants.
Well, you know, I remember when I first started teaching at Arizona State, and this was in the late 90s, I had a student on their final exam write that Black people should be happy to be in the United States because they were able to come over here on cruise ships and live in a country that's not third world. Cruise ships. Now, I would never see something like that today. I would never. And so I think it is the generation of teachers, different school systems. Like I do teacher training too through K through 12. So I go to do a lot of workshops with the NEH and the Department of Education. And a lot of those workshops, they have to adhere to what their testing standards are. But the teachers are hungry for more information. They said, okay, I know we have to teach for this test, but we want to give our students, even more information. So where are the documents? Can you give us some suggestions of documents that we can use that don't take us too far away, but that give our students more knowledge and more history to add to what they're required to know? And so I'm seeing the teachers having this desire.
Black human property was used as slave labor in almost every sector of the American economy. And for some people, they think about it as picking, shipwrights, potters, mines, engineers, we can go down the list. And I discovered a book. It was a compilation of patents. Because as we know, it's Black human property. We're inventing things. And that the patent laws allowed white slave owners to take control of those inventions. And that's right there in black and white. And you think about all that stolen labor, stolen genius, creativity, and all the ways, again, that African Americans negotiated this institution. I'm going to survive somehow.
And also, some of those same individuals bought their family members. Those are the people that, when we look at Black slaveholders, some of the quote-unquote Black slaveholders were purchasing relatives and living in pseudo-slavery so that then they could then move to the North once they got all the family together. And it might have taken several years for them to do that. There are other Black slaveholders that were trying to emulate their slaveholding masters, their fathers. Some of them were the offspring of a Black woman enslaver was the father. And some of those individuals, like the Ellison family out of South Carolina, were very brutal. And they owned slaves and they wanted to assimilate into white society. So when we talk about Black slaveholders, we can't just look at them as one monolithic group.
There's a letter you've probably seen because you read this like these are real people. I know it sounds just so repetitive, but they are just like us, flesh and blood, lived experience. They loved, they died, they had family, they had friends, they had enemies. And there's one letter, and I told my mother about it. It was a Black woman who owned her husband, and she'd written a letter or something threatening to sell him back to slavery because he was acting up and carousing.
Ooh,
and she held his paper. I was like, don't mess with her. I was like, I said, Mom, this Black fool is cheating on her, messing around with all these women, and she owns his freedom papers. Going to sell his raggedy butt down the river. But you read this stuff, and it's like maybe it's our blue sensibility that we can laugh. It's like gallows humor. Yes, it is. I think that is our blue sensibility, and it's always been there. It's always been a part of our culture. I've seen interesting documents, letters, stories. One of the things that I will say that has kept me sane in doing this history, this very difficult history, is the humor. Humor and faith. The faith that enslaved people had and the hope that they had of a better time, a better place, a better world. That's consistent. And then the humor that they have in that they're outsmarting their enslavers. Like, you might have me in chains, but I'm doing this, this, and this at night. Or I'm breaking this equipment. I'm sneaking away. I'm pilfering money. I'm planning for your demise. I'm going to get you. Exactly. Some enslaved people just felt like, you know what? They're going to get theirs. They're going to get theirs in another lifetime. And when I get out of this, I'm not going to worry about it. They're going to get theirs. And then there's others that
prayed fervently for their owners, prayed and prayed and prayed for their souls and their spirits while they were being whipped by them at the same time.
Now, that puzzled me. Is it that the sort of religious framework and an adaptive, cultural adaptation was like, okay, or personal morality, that you're so wicked that I'm just going to pray for you because you're so foul? I've written about this, talking about the Charleston church massacre and this expectation in American culture that black people always forgive. It's like one of the things I wrote that's gotten me many hundreds of emails, death threats and the like from, I'm sure, some black folks too who didn't get it. I was like, I'm tired. We don't have an obligation to forgive every crime. Because where are the white folks on the TV? Because again, this is not about power, not about skin color. Who, when a black person does something, or an Arab or a Muslim, whatever it may be, whoever it may be, where they're like, we forgive you. But there's this expectation about power that black folks always forgive. I mean, is that just some sort of version of Christian forgiveness? Because that befuddles me when I hear these stories about praying for your slave owner.
I think a lot of it does come from their Christian sensibilities. There's a story that I love to share about, it's my favorite enslaved person in the book, this guy named Isaac. And he had been converted in very close relationship with his minister, his pastor. And he was charged getting ready to incite a rebellion, and they caught him and they foiled the plan. And he was captured and taken into jail. And they wanted him to, they said, well, who else was involved? We want you to tell. He said, don't take anybody. I'm the only one. I'm the one. Take me. And he just kept saying that over and over again. And so his minister, they said, well, let's try to get a confession out of him. They send his minister to the jail cell. They have a 4-hour conversation. And it's just up and down with emotion. And, because these two had a very close relationship. They loved each other, and, he said, you brought me to God and all this stuff. He said, and Isaac said to him, he said, but let me tell you something. I love you and I love my master. He said, but I will kill you two first at the first opportunity I get. I know right from wrong. He said, you've taught me it. And he said, and I have my own sensibility about who I am and who I belong to in the spiritual sense. And I don't owe you anything. And as much as you've taught me all this Christian love, you're the first person I'd kill.
He's probably saying there's Christian vengeance and Christian justice too, the Old Testament.
Hypocrisy. There's so much contradiction within the institution of slavery. There's a journal that I found, written about it yet, but I found a journal in an archive where an enslaver was keeping track of the work that enslaved people were doing every single day. And just all the details, just this ledger book, long details. But on every other page, he had these prayer chants. And I haven't had a chance to analyze it because it's a very thick ledger book. I think that he's almost repenting as he's watching his enslaved people working. And we do know, and historians have written about this, that enslavers struggled too. The institution of slavery messed with their minds as well. We can see it in their journals when they actually share that. Treat somebody in the level of dehumanization that black people were treated during slavery for those that were treated very, very bad, had to mess with their mind as well.
There's Minds of a Master Class, and there's a second book that's a collection of letters and journals. Some of these people are sick. You're reading, and one letter that jumped out at me, and it was basically this white man who's a slave owner, and he's on his deathbed writing, he's like, I know I'm going to hell. I'm going to burn. But he's like, I love the money. And the money is so great, but I know I'm going to burn, exposing his soul.
That's greed. and so that's why some enslaved people looked at what was happening to them and they identified, in the Bible, and they could identify as, there's going to be another place. This is just a moment in our time, and there'll be another moment we'll be released from this. And so I think some of them could look at Christianity as a way to not justify, but to help them carry on. It gave them the strength to carry on.
That Nat Turner story is one a lot of folks have probably heard. But again, the first time I heard that years ago, it was jaw-dropping. But again, it was so powerful in terms of sort of the black body as a fetish object and collecting black folks' bones.
When Nat Turner was captured, before he was hung, they valued him. They gave him $1 of value, whenever enslaved people were about to be hung. Because, why? Owners of the former enslaved people that were being executed by the state governments in the South, were then compensated for the bodies of those enslaved people, that labor that they lost. So their property that was being destroyed by the state was then, I always say, enslavers received reparations before black people ever did. So Nat Turner was valued, $375, I think it was. He was hung. And just like we see in lynching in the future, he was decapitated. And they took his skin, they made grease out of his flesh, and they use these as relics, as trophies. Very similar to what we see when we look at the history of lynching. I always tell people that lynching was happening during slavery and bore out of slavery. It was birthed in slavery, but it wasn't called lynching at that time. And so his skull was passed around from different medical professionals at the time. And they were studying, and this is on the eve of racial science when people were trying to figure out, like, who's smarter, who's not. What, is black skin thicker than white skin? Is the skull, the cranium.
So it was basically like early phrenology.
Absolutely. From the white medical school perspective, they're just studying brains. There's some overlap here, right? Because the relics of lynchings and body snatching that's also happening at the same time was not necessarily about 19th century medical education. Depending on the perspective and who's involved, cannot always sort that out. His skull was looked at and examined by a number of medical students. It was held locally for a while. There was one document I found where a gentleman in his obituary was said, "I am the man who skinned Nat Turner." Like, he wanted that in his obituary and bragged about it. And it was in his obituary, which was published in the New York Times, by the way. And he said, "I would have skinned John Brown if I had the chance." John Brown, the white leader of the massacre in 1859, in Virginia. So Nat Turner's head is being circulated, and I find records of people who are saying that they had, and I just was led to just keep following where his head was, try to find out where it might have gone next. So I was going into medical schools that were nearby. I tried to get all the names of the doctors that were within Southampton County, Virginia, the doctors that were in surrounding communities. Were there any places where people had anatomy demonstrations in the area? And so I started studying that. I found a couple medical schools far north of Ohio where they said we had the cranium of Nat Turner. And supposedly it said on one of the descriptions said, "This is the skull of Nat Turner, a Negro who led an unsuccessful rebellion in Virginia," which I think is interesting that they called it unsuccessful. Now, we know as of lately that Richard Hatcher, the former mayor of Gary, Indiana, ended up with what is allegedly Nat Turner's skull. And he was holding on to it for a civil rights museum that he was going to have there in Indiana. But then he also was saying that he wanted to give the skull back to the defendant so that he could have his proper burial. And it was recently returned to the family. They did a segment on National Geographic, Nat Geo Explorer story on it. And they showed the descendants opening the box and actually seeing his skull for the first time. And in there were some notes that talked about all the different people who had Nat Turner's skull in their possession. So it's now in D.C., and they're doing some DNA testing to see if this is actually the potential skull of Nat Turner. We talk about slavery being so far away, or it's not that far removed. I mean, we have body parts that are unearthing all over: Mississippi, Virginia, Georgia, Maryland.
These are sacred burial grounds,
Absolutely. And we have descendants and family members who want to give their loved ones a proper burial and want to have some type of ceremony so that their souls can rest. And I think that when you asked me earlier about the spirits and all that, I think that there are a number of unsettled spirits of enslaved people that need attending to. And I think that's part of what's happening right now.
Well, America, is haunted by racism and racial violence and white supremacy. This is a history that there has been no reckoning for. And America is literally and metaphorically haunted. Because some folks be like, this is so macabre. But this is important because this is about power. It's about destruction of bodies. It's about collective grief and trauma. And also the flip side of that trauma, that type of racial violence was used to psychologically and materially empower white Americans as a group. And I'm just wondering about the skull of Nat Turner, right? Brother Turner. Is it like the skull was passed along from one senior lecturer to another? Play you for poker and cards and I'll get it that way. I mean, because you could see so many different ways that this hero, this martyr's body part could have been passed around.
I think it's a little bit of both. Some of it was actually people trying to study a black cranium and studying the cranium of someone who led this rebellion, who considered himself a prophet.
And thinking about it from the phrenology point of view, this would be an ideal type. This would be an amazing outlier. This is a Negro because black folks are not resistant by nature. So in the race science of the moment, this is an unusual case. We have to study it.
We have to study him. And this will tell us so much more about the Negro. That's exactly it. And then you have also folks that are just trying to play with relics, just play around with relics and for bragging rights, I have this, I have that, I found this, I have this fingertip, I have this ear, I have this piece of the nose, I have this piece of genitalia. This came to a head for me in class when I was telling the Nat Turner story that I just shared with you. And I had students that were sitting there looking at me like, there's no way. And then I had a student raise his hand. He said, there's a white male student. He said, I'm kind of not sure how to say this, but I'm fourth generation of medical doctors, and my father has a purse made out of human flesh. And I didn't write about all of this in the Times piece, but purse had different skin colors. One was black. I think one was white, and maybe one was maybe Native American. But I couldn't confirm that to go back because he was going to bring it to class and then his father wouldn't let him. So there's some shame around that, right? There's some shame there. If it's something that's a family relic and they're passing it around, well, then bring it in. I'd love to see it. Okay. So then I said, well, if your dad won't let you bring it, can you take a picture of it? Because we'd love to see it. The class was like, at that point, they believed me about the Nat Turner thing. They were like, okay, she's not this totally crazy nutty professor, but there's some truth to this. This actually still is happening. Well, after I wrote that piece, I got emails from all kinds of people, as you can imagine. I have a skull, I have an arm, I have a arm bone, I have a hip. I have these things because my great was a doctor, and we never knew what to do with it. What should we do with it? It is here. It is present and it's real. And why did they keep it? I have no idea. I mean, some of it could have been the relic thing. Some of it could have been just to study phonology. Some of it could be to justify aspects of racial science. It's hard to say.
You know, I have a colleague, a friend of mine, who's a professor. He teaches American Studies, and he was showing his class. They were talking about visual representations of lynching, and he was showing this very, very famous photo. I think it's Indiana, maybe East St. Louis, and it's African American. You see his feet, and all these white folks, gathered around pointing up. It's the photo that has the little girls, and folks are shocked at all these well-dressed white people. I was like, no, this is a celebration of white power. So he shows the photos, and there's a young white man, undergrad, who's a little older in the back, and he comes up to him, and my friend happens to be white. And he's really sheepish. And he's like, oh, what's wrong? And my friend called me after it happened. He couldn't believe it. And he said, the world's so small. And he said, in that photo, that's my grandfather in the crowd as a child. And he's like, no way. And he brought in a picture of his grandfather as a kid. It was him. History is here, and I'm thinking about the valuation. So paint a picture, if you would. How were the valuations done? So you have the ledger book, because, again, another historical question, because I did read this, so tell me if I'm wrong. So the state kills an African-American who's a runaway, someone who's leading a rebellion. For whatever reason, they're killed. Because these black folks were considered property and valuable property, and folks don't talk about the birth of insurance in the slave trade. Then couldn't the slavers write off the value and the lost labor as well?
And this is how I actually first stumbled upon through the insurance record and court cases is how I stumbled upon this notion of black bodies being valued in postmortem spaces. Is that somebody might have sued, like let's say an enslaved person was hired out to work, which means rented. Okay, so hired out to work for somebody for a certain amount of time. They die in their possession. And the other person, the owner then sues the person that they had rented the slave to. Sometimes these court cases took 6 or 7 years post-mortem. The enslaved person might have died in 1830, but it was like 1838 that the case was settled. And they received the financial value of that body, that person's body, that enslaved person, plus this for 7 years. And that's when I realized that this commodification we need to open up this conversation beyond the natural life cycle of a human being and look at the cycle of the body. I don't mean to, when I talk about black bodies, I'm not trying to depersonify them. I look at African Americans as people. I'm now looking at the body as something that's still commodifiable even beyond the life of the body.
Painting the picture of, again, how perverse the system is, because this is about it's capitalism mated, it's, as we say, it's race and class together, and slavery was economic system, and white supremacy was mated onto it to naturalize it, that, you would have these, sounds freakish to us, freakish stories about African Americans and our skin being used for umbrellas, shoes, purses. Then you'd have the relics that were traded in medical schools. Then you have, again, as you said, thinking about lynchings and genitalia, ears, noses, teeth being sold. One of the first types of mass culture in America, the lynching postcard. This is America's history. This is our history collectively. Hire out your slave, because again, Edward Baptiste's book is so powerful on this. The slave labor camp, you're taking this person, you're hiring their labor out, because I'm thinking about this as a business transaction. The person dies. What would the defense be? That this person was sick already or assumed risk within the normal work routine, and then the slaver would say, no, I own this person and you worked him too hard? What would be the basis of the legal claim?
You see both. You'll see the rightful enslaver saying, you worked them too hard and you owe me money for this person. And you see the person who rented them saying, this person was defective.
They're already sick or had a bad heart already. I had nothing to do with it.
Now, we also have, though, at some sales, they had warranties on different body parts. So they would also have on a warranty, for instance, women, they often had warranties on their uterus. And so they'd say, well, then she's going to give birth. I expected her to give birth to 4 or 5 children by now. And I've had her in my possession for 5 years and she hasn't given birth and I have a warranty. So I want my money back plus the interest on this warranty that I paid for.
This is business, just like you'd warranty a car. This is a capital investment in human property, and you're going to want your money back, plus some.
What I found with doing the research on insurance records was they put life insurance policies on enslaved people for a number of reasons. Sometimes when they were being sold or traded, so they would put, in case they died in the journey and they didn't make it to the sale, they wanted their money back. You know, they wanted to make sure they were guaranteed to make some kind of profit off of them. So you first see it like in marine insurance companies. Sometimes you saw slave policies with fire insurance companies. That's just what they were just sort of housed under. But I stumbled on a document that I write about that had more than 4,000 insurance records of individual enslaved people. Some of them were repeated in there. And the youngest person was 9 years old. And I thought to myself, and it was a female, so I'm thinking they're probably projecting, fertility, thinking about, or maybe her mother was a very fertile person, but this young girl, or maybe they were going to use her as a sex slave. So there was something that was valuable so that if she died, they wanted their money back. You see it even in there. And sometimes planters would sort of play on, this person's getting kind of sick. I'd rather them die because if they die, they're more valuable to me than if they stay alive. So sometimes they banked on these policies and they wanted to capitalize on them and cash them out.
So let's say an accountant or an actuary looked at the ledgers today. Because again, thinking about the birth of modern accounting and finance in America, that gets us to slavery too. Like, what would these ledger sheets look like? How would they make the valuation?
First of all, they had medical examiners that would come and identify. They often had a medical doctor that would then appraise them. So they'd have the name of the person, the name of the policy holder. They'd have a premium, like a percentage what the premium would be, what they would be paying per year. They would have another column for their age and then their value at that time. And then they would have a value for if they were to die, how they would cash that out. It's a very simple ledger book that would be easy to translate and understand today.
I mean, and that begs an obvious question I'm sure you get a lot. So one of the debates about reparations, whatever form they may take in America, in the United States, for the descendants of Black human property, African-American slaves, one of the things you'll hear is, well, we can't figure out how much money is involved, or how would you track the families or the people down, or the corporate entities don't exist. And in my reading and talking to economists and historians about this, a lot of my folks I've talked to have been like, no, you could figure it out and it wouldn't be that difficult. It's just we don't want the answers.
There are a number of companies we can trace directly to slavery and the slave trade because of the record books. There is some challenge. When we look at, and I think Ed Baptist would agree with this as well, if you're trying to find the paper trail of a particular transaction, sometimes it gets muddy because so many enslaved people were bought on credit. And so it's hard to follow the credit record sometimes to find out when people were actually paid out. Like they might be able to pay like half cash down on credit for 6 months. And sometimes we don't find the other end of that document where they completed the sale and the money was fully transferred over. So we don't always, sometimes we only have just one piece of it. Now, that doesn't mean we can still do a lot of this history and we can still name names easily. We can name a lot of names.
Black human property, again, is the basis of American empire in a lot of ways. African Americans are the number one capital good in this country. But how did Black folks, how did our ancestors value themselves? What were their ways of resisting this crude financial assessment of their humanity?
I think there's a couple interesting ways. One is they tried to make the investment in their bodies. They try to decrease the value of their body as an investment. One of the ways you see that, there was a case where a woman was on the auction block. Some auction blocks were tree stumps that were just chopped down, and some of them were cement steps. So she's on this auction block, and somehow there was an axe nearby. They're doing a bid on her body, on her, and she grabs the axe and chops off her hand and says, "How much am I worth now?" I mean, that's powerful. And to me, that is such a strong expression of what I call her soul value. And her trying to disrupt the sale the same way Walter Johnson talks about in Soul by Soul. That they're just trying to find ways to disrupt their sales and interfere with it. They'll lie. They'll try to negotiate. I haven't had any babies. All my babies die. And I give birth, they come out dead. I mean, they still say stuff like that in the auction block to decrease their value, to manipulate the sale. It's not so much motivated by the money aspect, but what I found is motivated by their choices of where they wanted to see themselves. Did they want to, or whether if they were trying to follow a relative that had been sold to that particular area of the country. And here's this trader coming from Alabama. Okay, then I either want him or don't want him to purchase me. There's another story that I wrote about a long time ago about this auction where this man was they were only selling couples, like people that were quote unquote married. And we know marriage was not legally sanctioned during slavery. But somehow they were saying, we're going to pair up these, and we're going to sell all the enslaved people here as units, and they're going to be kept in their family unit. this man gets sold and separated from his partner. And he says, tell them how strong you are. Tell them, you can do a heap of work in a day. You're just as strong as any old man on this plantation. Like, show them your arms. Like, he's like egging his wife on because he's afraid that she's not going to be purchased by the same person that purchased, and she wasn't. And they were sobbing. And it was just a sad departure.
And when you're discovering these stories, what do you do for yourself to sort of keep your balance emotionally or psychologically, spiritually? Like, how do you manage it?
I get this question all the time. And for a long time, I didn't realize that I needed to think about that clearly, because in 2007, when I was working on this book, which is right around when I started it, I would just say, I'm used to this. I've studied this. I've read this. And I didn't realize that I was giving a very distant response. I didn't realize I was doing that. And this one woman kept pushing me in the audience. She said, well, no, really, how do you feel? How does this make you feel? What do you do? How do you do this work? And I was like, some days I'm actually pretty pissed off. Other days I'm sad. Other days feel hurt, feeling the pain of this history. And so what do I do to balance it? Humor, comedy, mindless television shows, exercise, spending time with friends, walking and running my dog, things where I have to put it aside. Because when I wrote, I had to stay in a really deep space to stay centered. I kind of isolated myself a little bit, and most of my close family and friends would agree with that. And there was people I couldn't be around because their conversations to me seemed so simplistic and superficial. And I felt like what I was doing, and this is not judging them, but what I was doing was just so much heavier than talking about stuff that was going on that just didn't matter to me at the time. So I sometimes just couldn't engage. And I spent some time writing from a hotel, even left my own family there was their suggestion too, my husband's suggestion, but just to get in a space where I could work around the clock and stay in that writing zone. So I did a lot of that, but also then I had to turn it off. There's times where I had to just completely turn it off and focus on other things, just try to think about other things and not talk about it for a little bit. And, there was a certain cutoff time where my husband's like, okay, we're not going to be talking about this slavery and this rape and stuff like right before bed. Like, that's a little bit too much. Because I like to bounce ideas off of him, and we talk about things. And my son is also, just to get it sounds crazy, but to get a child's perspective on things, really interesting to have conversations with him about what I was doing. But there were other times where I just had to put it aside, but I was also there. Like, if I spent a whole day writing about a funeral or a burial, I come out from that and I'm supposed to go to a dinner party. It was hard for me sometimes to go. I was still at the funeral. I was still mourning the loss of this person or thinking about their lives, or the song that was sung at the funeral was going through my head while I'm at this dinner party, and I'm like, I can't engage right now. So there were times where I really had to separate myself.
There's a cost, that comes with doing, because you have to honor the ancestors and you have to do right by their memories. This is resistant work. It's sacred work. And I'm sure you can probably list folks who this type of work broke them. Because we've heard anecdotes and stories, folks studying the Holocaust, studying slavery, studying genocide, that if you take those demons home with you,
yes,
they can destroy you. And I always, not to be too dark, I always honor his memory. As a friend of mine, he was studying the Holocaust, and he already sort of had sort of depressive tendencies, but it ultimately drove him to kill himself.
Oh, wow.
And he's not the only one. It was a woman historian who wrote The Rape of Nanking. She also killed herself, I believe.
Wow.
A few other folks. I mean, that darkness, and you want to do the work, but it comes at a cost, serious cost, and you have to be able to manage it.
Yeah. So there are scholars that did their first book on slavery and said, I'm done. Like, I'm not doing this again. I have my close girlfriends that are not necessarily historians. One of my really good friends who's a professor but not a historian, she's like, if you do another book on slavery, I need you to do something different. But I do believe that this is really what I'm supposed to do. This is the history that I'm drawn to, and this is the history that I want to write. And it does come with a cost. Like, I need a break. I need a little bit of a break. I do it in class sometimes. We got to take a break from some of this difficult history, and we got to look at, like, where do Black people find joy? Where do they find, like, let's look at a wedding, let's look at dances, let's talk about the spaces of joy, because even in slavery, even in enslavement and captivity, they laughed, they loved, they shared, they married, they celebrated. It doesn't mean that they were happy and they enjoyed being enslaved. It just means that they tried to find balance within this horrific institution that was subjecting them to all kinds of traumatic experiences.
What is your thought on the African American History Museum down in D.C.? Have you been there yet?
I have been there, and I spent an entire day and I didn't even get to the upstairs floors. I got through U.S. history up until today. through the Obama election, and that's all I got. I have not even been to the art. I haven't been to the other floors. And I know a lot of my colleagues and friends consulted on that museum. So I think it's an amazing space, and it's important for people, not just Black people, to go to this, but it's a very important place for people to see and understand the full trajectory of African American history in the United States. Because we've had a very, very challenging experience in the United States, and we've survived and found ways to thrive.
You've worked on Roots, and I got to ask you about Django and your thoughts about Django. And I'll put my cards on the table with Django. I think it's a very important work of public scholarship and public pedagogy and public history, even though it's packaged as fantasy.
Well, I didn't like Django. There's a lot of historians that do, but let me tell you what my challenge has been with Django, and I've written about this. But my challenge was that students come into my classroom thinking that that's the story of slavery. And I know it's a film and they shouldn't, and it's just Hollywood. People always say, oh, Daina, it's just Hollywood. Loosen up, loosen up. But then I have to go correct that because the students are like, I didn't know slaves didn't know how to horseback ride. Slaves were on horses all the time. But because of that, they made that whole thing about, this is a Negro on a horse. But enslaved people rode horses. So that's like, you debunk that. So I think when that movie came out and when I was teaching, it was so much about debunking. It was debunking so many things. Like, here he is, Jamie Foxx's character is walking around, he's going, they didn't have a level of freedom of movement that he's showing. Now, I'm being very literal. So I have used Django to teach slavery, to show the actual history and to show what parts of it, not to say that this was right and this was wrong. Let's really explore whether or not how this could happen. What was the experience like? 21st century fantasy version of it. But let's talk about the real history here.
In terms of a film that you think gets the history right, would it be 12 Years a Slave? And what would be some ones that you would recommend?
I love 12 Years of a Slave. And I actually taught it one semester. And my students and I went and saw it as a class. Unfortunately, it was a very traumatic experience for them. I mean, they were really struggling through that film. And I thought I had prepared them.
What did they find so challenging? I mean, the idea that a Black person who is educated and quote-unquote literate who could be kidnapped and have his life ruined. I mean, does this hit too close to home with the stereotypes they have or don't have? Like, it could have happened to me. Because, Black folks love to say, I would have been no slave. They wouldn't have got me. Okay, we'll see.
Say that, yeah, you don't know what you would have done. Like, I don't even know what I would have done. I say that all the time. You can't say what we would have done. The students in that class were predominantly white. And I had a few Black students in that class. It was a small seminar. But what I had done for the semester was I prepared them, because I teach slavery by teaching them around the senses. So touch, smell, taste, that kind of thing. So they said it was sensory overload. They said that they were overloaded the music, and we were actually at a theater where you could eat, which I didn't think about that going in. And so they were eating while they were trying to watch, and they lost their appetite. They were overwhelmed by the music and the visuals, and I could say for me, who's read tons of stuff about slavery and looked at all kinds of images and films and so forth, I hadn't thought about the camera angle, which I thought was brilliant, of when he was being whipped in the jail. You saw the camera angle was such that the man that was whipping him, you could see it was a workout for him to whip somebody. And it was such a chilling camera angle. I said to myself, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about, not that I'm saying woe is him that whips. I'm just saying I hadn't thought about the level of physical exertion that they were willing to take themselves to just to beat or prove a point. And I experienced that again when I was on set for Root, when they filmed the whipping scene. But he was worn out. And it was a real whip that he was using. He wasn't making contact, but he was using a real whip, and he was worn out. And that's my takeaway that was one of my really interesting takeaways from 12 Years of a Slave. The other thing I do when I talk about Django in class, though, I don't know if you remember there was a controversy around dolls. They were selling some dolls, like action figures. But I got a hold of some of the dolls when I brought them to class and we talked about it. It's like, okay, what does this mean? And I did not get a Broomhilda doll because the Broomhilda doll was literally $800. And to me, that was such a chilling connection to an actual enslaved person's value back during slavery. And I thought their doll is so valuable that she's even being sold from a fantasy, fictional character in a film. And that doll is so, I don't even think they made as many of the Broomhilda dolls. So I have almost all the other characters but her.
I'm a huge Quentin Tarantino fan. I believe he's a Negrophile or not. But I mean, you have this interesting puzzle where sort of historical quote unquote accuracy, the ideology of the film. And there's some really great book. Brother Adelifu Namu has a great book about Django. Sort of you have these white conservatives. Oh my God, it's about a Black man killing white people. Oh my God, woe is me, moral panic. But the movie, in a lot of ways, despite Tarantino's intent, I believe, but again, Texas ideologically mixed, as you certainly know, that it's very conservative in a lot of ways. in the sense that it allows the white viewer to read themselves into the film as the hero. They're Dr. King Schultz. They're not Leo DiCaprio at Candyland. And then they can lie and says, look at all this black resistance. It's so exciting. Look how they fought back. I'd be on the side of Django. No, you wouldn't have been.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's really an interesting point. My husband always jokes, and he says that in his experience with talking about films like this, is that people latch on to the white hero or the white person that's the savior.
Wow, Dr. Berry, some great teaching and sharing. Where can folks find you online, your work, emails, the price for their pound of flesh, all the other great work you've done?
So I have a website that's just my name. It's drdainarameyberry.com. It's DAINA, Ramey, RAMEY, Berry, BERRY.com. And I have my editorials, op-eds that I've written, articles, my books. I have links to everything on my website, and I pretty much keep it pretty updated. Also a list of my upcoming speaking engagements and radio interviews.
I want to thank Professor Berry one more time for that great teaching and sharing. Send her an email. Tell her thank you for her great work and how she's contributing to our understanding